5 minutes later. 1 hour later. A few times later. 1 week later. 1 ambulance later. A few moments later. A few moments later. 5 minutes later. 30 minutes later.
It's been 9 months.
A few dot moments later.
10 minutes later.
1 week later.
A few moments later. 1 hour later. A few moments later.
A few moments later. Number 1.
A few moments later.
Sometime later.
A few moments later. A few moments later. 2,000 years later. A few moments later.
1 ambulance later. Alert. What that is into the beat construction montage. A few is like
A few hours later. A few hours later.
a few years later again. A few hours later.
A few hours later.
A few moments later.
A few moments later. A few moments later.
A few moments later. A few moments later.
A few moments later.
A few moments later.
A few moments later.
A few moments. A few moments later. 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 A few moments later.
A few seconds later. 1 minute later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 2 very boring minutes later. 5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
Minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later.
15 minutes later.
15 minutes later. 20 minutes later.
A little later. Later still. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 57 seconds later. A few seconds later. 1 minute and 37 seconds later. 2 very boring minutes later.
5 minutes later.
A few minutes later.
2 minutes later. Hours later.
10 hours later.
2 hours later.
A few days later. 1 month later.
Approximately 10 hours later.
12 hours later.
12 sleepless hours later. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. Early the next morning. 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 Tomorrow. The very next evening. The next evening. The next Christmas. 1 day later.
Game over.
48 hours later. 2 days later. Day 3. 2 weeks later. 16 parallel 2 days later. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later. 6 months later. 6 months later. 7 months later. 7 months later. Many months later.